Imagine living in a neighborhood where your own front door feels like a prison gate. That was my reality when the HOA decided to ban me from stepping outside after 7 p.m. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, maybe a silly rule they'd eventually drop, but I quickly learned they were dead serious. The idea of being told when I could and couldn't leave my own house was not just controlling, it was terrifying. Neighbors whispered, some were too scared to speak up, and I realized I wasn't the only one being pushed around. What started as a strange curfew turned into something much darker. Every evening when the sun went down, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And when I refused to stay silent, the HOA came at me hard. They tried intimidation, they tried threats, and when that didn't work, things escalated. Suddenly, I wasn't just facing unreasonable rules, I was facing people who thought they had the power to control every move I made. I knew I had a choice: back down and let them win, or stand up and fight for my freedom. But standing up wasn't easy. It meant exposing the truth, gathering proof, and risking even more pressure from the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood. The night it all came crashing down, everything I had prepared for was tested. I stood my ground, while they tried to corner me, and in that moment, I realized the fight had reached its breaking point. What happened next turned the entire HOA upside down and left people in shock. And let's just say, the ones who thought they had all the power weren't the ones standing tall in the end. The strangest part about the whole situation was how it all started. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought the HOA was just like any other, strict about lawns, fences, and parking rules, but nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I believed. Over time, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. Letters slipped into mailboxes with warnings about small things like walking your dog too late, or even leaving your porch light on. Past a certain hour, most people just obeyed, not because they agreed, but because they didn't want to stir up trouble. When my turn came, it was different. I received a notice saying I was restricted from being outdoors after 7 p.m., something I had never heard of in any community. It sounded outrageous, and at first I laughed it off. But then neighbors warned me quietly, almost nervously, that ignoring the HOA's orders could have consequences. One even told me she had been fined for simply checking her mailbox after dark. That's when I realized this wasn't just a rule, it was a system of control. And people were scared into silence. The more I pushed back, the more the tension grew. The HOA board members weren't just enforcing rules, they were acting like they owned the entire block. They sent me more letters, knocked on my door late at night, and started watching me whenever I came or went. I could feel the pressure building with every step I took. I began to wonder what they were hiding, why they were so desperate to keep people inside after sundown. It didn't feel like it was just about control anymore. Something deeper was going on, and I knew if I kept digging, I was going to uncover the reason they didn't want anyone outside. The real conflict began when I decided I wouldn't stay silent anymore. I started documenting everything: letters, conversations, even the strange looks I got from certain board members whenever I stepped outside. At first, it felt like I was just standing up for myself. But the more I uncovered, the more it seemed like this wasn't just about me. Other neighbors were living in quiet fear, following rules that made no sense just to avoid the constant harassment. Some admitted they had been fined hundreds of dollars for simple things, like sitting on their porch too long in the evening. One night, a neighbor across the street whispered to me that she had also tried pushing back years ago. She said the HOA made her life so unbearable that she eventually gave up and sold her home. That conversation stuck with me. It made me wonder how many people had been forced out and how much power these board members really held. It wasn't just about curfews anymore. It was about control, money, and intimidation at the same time. I noticed something strange. A few of the board members met late at night near the clubhouse. They would gather quietly, and sometimes cars I didn't recognize would pull in and leave before sunrise. I couldn't help but think there was more to these rules than anyone realized. Meanwhile, the pressure on me only grew. I'd find anonymous notes slipped under my door, warning me to cooperate or face consequences. My security cameras even caught one of them standing at the edge of my driveway, just staring at my house. Every step I took closer to the truth seemed to push them further into desperation. And deep down, I knew I was getting close to uncovering the reason they wanted me locked inside after dark. The night everything came to a head started like any other. I stepped outside just after sunset, determined not to let their so-called curfew control me. The air was heavy, almost too quiet, and I could feel that something was about to happen. My porch light flickered for a moment, and when I looked across the street, I saw the same group of HOA board members gathered near the clubhouse. Only this time, they weren't whispering. They were pointing in my direction, their faces set. In cold, determined stares. I knew they had been trying to push me into a corner, but now it felt like they were done with warnings. My phone buzzed with a message from one of my neighbors. "Don't go outside tonight." My heart was pounding. If I went back inside, I'd be proving them right that they could scare me into silence. If I stayed out, I'd be forcing a confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for. The tension reached another level. When I noticed two unfamiliar cars circling the block, slowing down each time they passed my house. Headlights cut across my yard, lingering just a little too long, like they were marking me. I gripped the folder of evidence. I had been collecting letters, photos, videos, knowing it was the only protection I had if things got out of hand. Then, without warning, the group from the clubhouse started walking toward me, their voices carrying through the still night. Every step they took made the air feel tighter, heavier. My neighbor's curtain moved, just slightly, as if others were watching from behind closed blinds, too afraid to do anything. And in that moment, standing in the middle of my own driveway, I realized the showdown I had been preparing for was no longer a possibility, was already here. As the group closed in on me, I braced myself for the confrontation I had been expecting all along. But then, something I didn't anticipate happened. From the shadows near the end of the street, another neighbor stepped out, someone I hadn't spoken too much since moving in. He walked straight toward us, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Enough," he said firmly, and the HOA board froze for a moment. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone else to stand up. What shocked me even more was what he revealed. He whispered quickly as he reached me, "You're right. They've been covering things up. That's why they want everyone inside at night." My stomach dropped. I had suspected there was more to this curfew than simple control, but hearing it confirmed was a different kind of fear. The board members exchanged uneasy looks, clearly not liking that someone from their own community had spoken out, just when I thought the situation couldn't escalate further. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The HOA members stiffened, their confidence slipping for the first time. One of them muttered something under his breath and pulled out a phone, pacing nervously. Why would they be so rattled by the police? Unless, of course, they had more to hide than I realized. The neighbor beside me leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "They're not just enforcing rules. They've been running something at night that they don't want outsiders to see." My mind raced as I tried to connect the pieces: the secret late-night meetings, the strange cars, the desperate need to keep people locked indoors. The board members were only a few feet away now, their expressions shifting from anger to panic. And in that moment, I knew the real story was far bigger and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The sirens grew louder, and before anyone could react, flashing lights filled the street. Police cars rolled up and officers stepped out, shining their flashlights across the tense scene. The HOA board, who had always acted untouchable, suddenly looked cornered. One officer asked what was happening, and before the board members could spin their version of the story, I held up the folder of evidence I'd been collecting. Every letter, every video clip, every photo of them harassing me and my neighbor's was all there. The neighbor who had stepped forward backed me up, telling the officers everything he knew. He spoke about the secret meetings, the unexplained cars, and the intimidation tactics that had driven families away. The officers listened carefully, and the board members began stumbling over their own words. For the first time, they weren't in control. One of the officers stepped aside to make a call, and within minutes, more patrol units arrived. The sight alone was enough to shatter the HOA's confident act. The tension broke when officers ordered several of the board members aside and began questioning them individually. Their stories didn't match, and soon enough, 2 of them were placed in handcuffs right there on the street. Neighbors who had been hiding behind curtains started stepping outside, watching in shock as the people who once ruled the neighborhood with fear were finally exposed. But just when I thought it was over, the biggest twist came. One officer pulled me aside and said quietly, "This isn't just about your HOA. We've been investigating them for months." That single sentence sent chills down my spine. It turned out my fight for freedom had uncovered something much larger, and though the board was falling apart, I realized this was only the beginning of a bigger story still unfolding. In the days that followed, the entire neighborhood felt different. The same people who once peeked through blinds now walked outside freely, finally realizing they didn't have to live in fear anymore. The HOA's stranglehold had been broken, and with some of its leaders facing charges, their rules no longer carried weight. The so-called curfew was gone, and for the first time in a long while, the street felt like a community again instead of a place under surveillance. Neighbors began sharing stories they had been too afraid to tell before about fines, harassment, and the strange late-night activity that had gone unchecked for years. It all painted a clear picture of how far the board had gone to control people, and how easily silence had allowed them to get away with it. Standing there listening, I realized that what started as my personal battle against an unfair rule had actually opened the door for everyone else to finally speak up. The officers stayed in touch with me as their investigation continued, and while they didn't share all the details, it was clear that HOA's corruption reached further than anyone had guessed. Knowing I had helped shine a light on it made all the nights of pressure and intimidation worth it. In the end, what mattered most was that the people living here finally felt safe in their own homes. I had stepped into a fight I never asked for. But walking away, I understood the bigger lesson. When someone stands up to control and intimidation, it gives others the courage to do the same. This wasn't just about an HOA curfew anymore. It was about taking back freedom. And though the struggle had been hard, I wouldn't change a single step, because together, we finally reclaimed our neighborhood.